In this video, I'll make a modern interpretation of a notebook dated 1793 that is held in the National Archives of the UK. This book is covered in full leather but with turn-ins at the foredge of the boards only. It's a simple but attractive piece of stationery that's robust but easy to make. Like last time, this book is fairly straightforward, but not without its twists, and I have a lot of talking to do. I'll get straight into the work and then do the talking as you watch me fold and sew the sections. I'm going to follow the makeup of the original book, which is 7 sections of 6 sheets each. This book did not have the interleaved blotting paper, so I don't add these this time. I don't know if the originals were lined, but I printed my own paper with 6 of the sheets having lines only on one leaf, so I have 3 blank leaves on the outside of the book. Again, I need to acknowledge Holly Smith, who did the research and wrote the article that made this video possible. The article title is Exchequer Exhibits 18th and 19th Century Stationery Bindings at the National Archives in the UK, and it was published in Bookbinder, the journal of the Society of Bookbinders. To subscribe to the journal, you become a member of SOB and you get sent it every year along with newsletters and other benefits. Back copies are available in limited quantities from Hewitt & Sons, and the details are in the description. This book is based on case study number 1. It's a small notebook about 80% the size of A5 and it's dated 1793. Like the last book, it's sewn all along on 2 parchment tapes. The paper is described as off-white laid with some watermarks. The boards are attached to the outer leaves of the outer sections, and after the book is covered in leather, with turn-ins at the foredge of the boards, the next leaf of each outer section is used as a paste down. Since I have 3 blank outer leaves, I will have 1 left as the blank first free end paper, or flyleaf as it's called in some communities, which is everyone but bookbinders. There were some great questions in the comments for the last video and on my Patreon, so I'll try and answer some of these now. Well, I'll try to anyway. Why are there no end papers on this book? Great question. I've got a whole introductory video on end papers, so this is going to be a short answer to a big topic. Also, I'm talking historically and probably more 19th and early 20th century, which captures the book I'm working on. After a book was printed in sheets, the sheets or folded sheets would go to the bookbinder. The very first page was probably the half title. There's no blank leaves to use as an interface between the binding and the text, or it can't be counted on. The intermediate structure between the text and the covers is the end papers. The printer may have supplied some blank paper, but otherwise it's the binder's job to find appropriate paper and make end papers and ultimately bind the book. For a more complex piece of stationery, such as double-entry accounting ledgers, where the pages are ruled and numbered, again an interface in the form of end papers is needed. But for this simple notebook, which was probably blank paper and no publisher involved, the outer leaves are free to be used as the interface to the binding. I don't know, and I'm researching this, but I wonder if binders didn't make these on spec, something to fill time when work was slow. Then they're their own client, and they just have to make sure the book has sufficient paper to be useful once some of it's used in the binding process. Thus, why this very specific type of book doesn't have separate end papers. If you've watched a few of my videos, you'll know I occasionally have problems with my cameraman. This time it was the sound engineer. Someone noted a problem with the sound in the last video. The microphone cable was coming loose. The problem only became clear when it fell out completely. Unfortunately, some of this video is missing the background sound. Even the editor didn't pick up on it in the last video. It looks like I'm going to need a whole new team. At the hinge, under that thin leather, there's only a sheet of paper from the section. Is it enough to sustain the leather not deteriorating from potential heavy usage? I can see the concern. Quality leather is strong, and the best test is the test of time. These books haven't seen a lot of use since being archived, but they got good use before then. The key is the quality of the leather. A chrome-tanned leather would have turned to dust in this time. Remember that when you're cutting up a couch jacket or a handbag to cover a book. But I think if I make a modern interpretation to sell, I would add a thin cotton spine lining that wraps around the spine and under the boards about 1 inch. Not having a paper guillotine is very frustrating. I think the best option is to trim all the sections to the same size before sewing. With careful pre-punching the sewing holes, I'm sure you can produce a very respectable notebook. You can even attach the boards oversize and trim to match the text after attaching. I'll do that with the foredge of the boards in this video. I chose Rami band as the sewing supports because it's smooth like parchment, and because of the colour it even looks a bit like parchment. I use the narrower version, which I think is 12mm wide, or is it 10? I love Rami band as a sewing support. It's so strong and yet so thin. Yet, if you wet it, the very long fibres will separate and you can fan them out, hiding them under a paste down, if that's what you want to do. Rami is a no-stinging nettle from East Asia. The very strong and long bast fibre is used to make all sorts of things, and a ribbon that happens to be useful for bookbinding. I associate Rami band with German bookbinding, and maybe for no good reason except this is where I first came across it, and I import it from Germany. In terms of bookbinding supplies, it seems to be easier to buy anywhere than Germany. I often see beginner bookbinders use lots of sewing stations and wide ones. This may be fine for the types of books they're making, which are usually square-backed or require minimal swell. For many books, swell is a required feature, and the swell comes from the sewing thread inside the sections. You want the sewing thread inside the sections as much as possible. This is why I use supports as narrow as seems reasonable and no closer than needed. I think roughly 2 inches or maybe 50mm is a good distance between the supports and the sewing stations such as kettle stitches. The parts of the book without thread inside the sections is the hardest to round and back. This is why the head and tail are the hardest to back, often made worse by overly tight kettle stitches. Except for large ledger-style books, the widest supports I use are 10 to 13mm for cotton, linen and Rami band, and my favourite is 6mm wide linen tape, and sometimes I'll use 4mm. The observation that this binding is similar to Die Stiefbrochuren is spot on. Binding the codex form of the book in this manner is almost intuitive. You fold the paper, connect it somehow with some form of sewing, glue something heavier duty on the outside to protect it, and then you look at it and think it's a bit, well, ugly, so you cover it somehow. Variations of this are common in trade or commercial bookbinding in the 19th and early 20th century. Once you start looking for them in used bookstores, you'll see heaps of them. One of the most charming books on bookbinding, Simple Bookbinding for Junior Schools by William Matthews, is made this way. In trade bindings, the book is usually sewn by a machine and doesn't use sewing supports. If you sew it by hand and don't want to use sewing supports, you can use one of the common link stitches, such as commonly called Coptic sewing or French link, but I think the sewing supports add a useful additional board attachment, and obviously so did the stationery binders of the past. It's funny how poorly documented it is in the English language literature on bookbinding, with an exception being Peter Verheyen's nice article. Casebook 1 looks to have the same slight round which is described for Casebook 2 as a notable amount of swell forcing the sections into a gentle natural round. This is one area I wanted to improve in this second attempt. To get more swell, I used the thickest thread I have, which is about 0.7 of a millimetre thick. I also didn't do any compression along the spine folds during sewing. I was very happy with the resulting swell, which was about 10%. What does the article mean about the swell forcing the book into a natural round? The swell is most when the sections are aligned and the threads are on top of each other. Rounding is often described as a way of distributing the swell. By rounding the book, the threads are no longer stacked on top of each other. If there's enough round, the threads are lined up next to each other and maybe the swell is reduced to 2 thicknesses of thread, one for each side of the book. And with a bit of force, this can be reduced more. But what is a natural round? You can stack rocks, but it results in an unstable equilibrium. A slight perturbation and the rocks slide off each other. You could think of sections being like that. Given the opportunity, they will try and distribute the swell until a new equilibrium is established, maybe constrained by the kettle stitches. The sections move towards a higher state of entropy. You can even see this slightly when I put the book in the finishing press to glue the spine. The compression by the press develops a slight round. Books often develop a round even if you didn't design the book to have one. I suspect this is what the author meant by a natural round. The question for me is, should I try and bind the book with a square back and see if it develops a round, or do I encourage the round? I decide to develop the round gently, not with a hammer, just through manipulation. I trim the foredge of the book first. The case books look to have a slight round in the foredge, thus they were trimmed with a square spine. Instead of using a hammer, I bend up the foredge of the book up at an angle and then grip it tight and lower it, which pulls the outer sections forward. I do this a few times from each side of the book until a gentle round develops. I'm very pleased with the result and it looks similar to the case books. I wonder if this is what the binders did 200 years ago. I thought the board I used in the previous book was too thick. I was going to try and find some 1mm board, but this didn't happen. I decided to laminate some 0.6mm card to make 1.2mm board. Laminated board tends to be a bit stiffer, which is also a good thing. Once I've finished with the book, I still feel like the boards are a bit thick. I'll need to do another prototype with a slightly thinner board. Like the other book, I bevel the edge of the board. Someone left a comment wondering if I cut the beveled edge off with the guillotine. No, the beveled edge goes towards the spine. I wonder if I didn't misspeak and accidentally say I put it towards the foredge. The bevel allows the leather to transition onto the paper without leaving a little gap at the edge of the board where the paper and board aren't attached. To a lesser extent, it also matches the slight round of the spine. This is a feature of some other bindings, especially earlier ones with wooden boards. I trim the boards to the height of the book and then attach them. This time I put them a bit closer to the spine, only 2mm away. I didn't trim them to width. I trim them at the foredge after I've attached them to the book and after the glue is dried. Don't use the paper on the inside of the boards as your guide to trim them to width. This paper will stretch slightly. You need to mark the inside of the boards using the first unattached leaf. A little strip of paper, maybe 1mm wide, will remain on the waste after trimming. There was a great question about when I use the steel press or the weight of a brick. First, I want to mention something about the green press I have in the middle of my bench. These heavy steel presses that open just enough for one very thick book, and which are so common in the bookbinding community, all of them were originally made as copy presses, not as bookbinding presses. Before typewriters, just about every office had one. A special book would be written in with specific inks, and then the book would be pressed and a copy of the written leaf would be transferred to the adjacent page. The original would be torn out and used, and the copy remained for the records. This is why they don't open very far. They only needed to accommodate the copybook. The copying process was done with pressure and chemicals. This is why they can exert so much pressure, which is much more than is needed for most bookbinding operations. My little press can exert so much pressure, if I put my shoulder into it, I can damage paper, press the surface texture out of it, or even remove the impression from letterpress printing. In some ways, it's better a beginner use the brick than a press like this to avoid damaging things with too much force. When I was younger, I was terrible at pressing cloth-bound books too hard and glazing the book cloth. The brick will meet most of your pressing needs. Pressing freshly folded sections is certainly something that likes some extra force, but many things will go better with just a bit more than what the brick can provide. A book that's just been cased in is a good example. It can easily be overpressed, maybe pressing an impression of the sewing supports into the text paper, but a bit more than the brick can crisp up the joint and let the glue dry while under good compression, giving a nice solid book. But I'd rather have a book that was pressed under a brick and is just a bit soft than one that was overpressed and the cloth or paper is being damaged. If I wasn't making videos, I'd use the press a lot more. Putting a book in the press under a light weight frees up the bench so I can move on to other jobs. But using a brick in the videos is a way to let you know which pressing jobs only require lighter pressure. Also, I don't want anyone to think that not having a press is a barrier to bookbinding. Every professional binder in the world has covered bricks that get used all the time. On the original book, the leather turns in around the foredge and extends about 10% of the width of the board. I decide to add 30mm for each turn-in. I make a paper template to help cut out a piece of leather out of the skin. I get a bit lucky and can cut a piece with very little waste. The leather has some imperfections and I place these on the back cover. The spine of the animal is very clearly visible in the leather, and this will run down the front of the book about a third of the width away from the spine of the book. I got lucky there, as I think it's a nice little feature, which most people won't notice, but I will. I really dislike using PVA with leather. Flower paste is so much more relaxing. I'm worried about at least two things: getting the leather tight enough around the spine without stretching the leather on the boards, and the PVA striking through. In traditional leather bookbinding, you would place the spine of the book in the centre of the leather and then flip the book over so it's resting on its foredge and gently draw the leather over the spine. This isn't going to happen with PVA. I decide to treat it like cloth and glue the backboard on and then draw the leather around to the front. This goes reasonably well, and I only get a few spots of PVA on the grain side of the leather. I've seen people using PVA in leather where they apply the PVA to the board. This seems a sensible approach to preventing the glue striking through. This approach worries me in that board loves to soak the moisture out of glue, and leather is rather fibrous and thirsty too. I worry about the bond using this approach, so I decide to stick with gluing out the leather. Maybe because of my concern about getting a good bond, I do over-apply glue, especially at the spine, and the result is some unsightly glue strike through in that area. I'll point it out. This has all given me a lot to think about when it comes time to use protein-based adhesives. I have thought about and investigated what I think are the obvious other options. The most obvious is lining the leather with paper, which is common with the very thin leather of spine labels and onlays, but that's a lot of extra work for a large piece of leather, and I'm sure this wasn't done historically. Using less glue on the leather and also putting a thin layer of glue on the boards. I'm fairly good at juggling pieces of a book as I put it together, but I know from experience this is a good way to get glue everywhere. Or I just glue out the boards and spine and not worry about the leather lifting after a few years, and it probably won't. I do the turn-ins and insert blotters and moisture barriers and let the book dry under a brick. I was asked why leather-bound books aren't pressed in the steel press after covering. When the leather is wet, it's susceptible to being crushed. You can very easily, without much pressure, press the grain out of the leather, leaving an ugly mess. In my case, I also don't want to force the glue through the leather, though it makes its way anyway. There was an exception around the late 19th century where there was a fashion for polished flat leather. This was done by pressing the book between steel plates with significant pressure and then varnishing the leather. This has gone out of fashion. I bet everyone has a local archive or records office that contains old stationery bindings nearby. You might consider trying to find one near you and look for a book you might like to make a model of. It's a fun and instructional exercise to survey a collection and then to choose some items to study in detail. Working through the exercise of photographing the book, mapping or charting out the details such as the section configuration, end paper design, sewing, board attachment method, and then drawing and taking notes to use later. When you get home, you find there are details you overlooked. How thick was the board and paper? What sort of paper was it? Did you take photos of the paper backlit to show watermarks or chain lines? How thick was the sewing thread? You'll learn much more from doing this exercise than from reading about it. Once the book is dry, I trim the head and tail with the guillotine. I should have put down the pastedowns before trimming the book, but I got distracted and forgot. A lot of my videos are repetitive, folding, punching holes and sewing. My goal in the videos is to show you how a book is made, the entire process. I hope a lot of you appreciate seeing the full process, even if you've seen many of the steps before and done many of them yourself. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't have the time and patience to watch a process like this in real time in a YouTube video. Thus, when I think it's appropriate, I speed the video up. When I watch myself binding at 4 times speed, I feel like the Superman of bookbinding. But I know sometimes I overdo it, like I feel I might have in this video. I get gentle reminders of this occasionally in the comments. Because the outer leaf is almost exactly the width of the board, I trim a couple of millimeters off before putting it down. Even with the thick PVA, it will stretch a bit, and I don't want it extending past the edge of the board. The pastedowns go down perfectly aligned at the head and tail of the boards, and no harm came from my moment of distraction. Okay, back to the speed. One of these recent comments got me thinking, and I decided to do an experiment. I removed the background music from a completed video and reset the speed to 100% for the entire video. I did some other minor editing, and that was it. A 20-minute video went to over 90 minutes. I'm sure no one would watch an entire video in this format, but if there is a step that's hard to follow because I have sped it up, now there's an easy way to see it in real time. I've published a couple of these to everyone, including the free level of my Patreon. I'm going to slowly work through old videos and do this conversion and put them on Patreon for the paying levels. If you are a Patreon and you want me to prioritize a particular video, let me know through Patreon. Unfortunately, I'm finding some of the early videos have corrupted files and I'm not able to make these changes. I feel bad about putting these real-time videos behind a paywall, but they take time and resources to provide. The main income for Daz Bookbinding is Patreon. The YouTube ad revenue doesn't even cover the basic running costs of the business. My goal is to democratize bookbinding by making quality teaching about solid traditional skills accessible to everyone. It's only possible thanks to the generous support of the people who are in a position to do so, becoming Patreons. Not only are you helping me, you're helping the people who can't afford courses or access to the sort of bookbinding educational content I hope I provide. Okay, that's enough of the hard sell. The article describes the minimal decoration of this book as having a scalloped edge pattern blind tooled around the head, spine and foredge. The author speculates the binder forgot to tool the tail edge, as other similar books do have the tooling on all four edges. I was going to finish the video by blinding a border on the cover, but I don't have a tool that looks anything like the original. I thought I had something that would do, but I decided it just didn't match the binding in style or period. This is something else I'll have to consider what to do about for the historical model. I'm afraid my work's been disrupted by weather again. A monster cyclone is slowly moving offshore down the Queensland coast, threatening to wreak havoc somewhere. I'm trying not to panic, but I am making sure I'm in a good position to implement the flood plan if I have to. I'll take a break from these stationery bindings for a couple of weeks and maybe revisit some older videos. This will also give me time to research some details for the historical models. I hope you're enjoying this series. Take care, and until next time, cheerio.